So I'd like to talk to you today about the state of global democracy. And here I think we've got some problems. Beginning in the early 70s, we experienced what's been called the third wave of democratization, where the number of democracies around the world went from about 35 to maybe 115 or 120 by the mid-2000s. But since about 15 years ago, we've been in what my colleague, Larry Diamond, has called a democratic recession, in which the number of democracies has been falling and a number of other important negative developments have occurred. One is the rise of authoritarian states like Russia and China. They're big, they're consolidated, and they're seeking to project their influence around the world. But perhaps the more troublesome event is the rise of what's been called populist nationalism. Populism doesn't have an agreed definition among political scientists, but there are several features of it. So one has to do with the belief of populists that they represent the people against a very corrupt elite. They have a charismatic style of governing. They think that they've got a mandate, having been legitimately elected by the people, but that makes them anti-institutional. Institutions are things like the checks and balances of the American Constitution that prevent the executive from exercising unlimited power. And because they believe they've got this popular mandate, these populists attack institutions. They attack the press, they attack the courts, they attack the bureaucracy, and that undermines the liberal part of liberal democracy. That is to say, the whole constitutional, institutional structure on which a modern democracy is based. And then finally, the right-wing version of populism tends to talk about the people in limited terms that is defined by ethnicity or race. So, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is probably one of the first examples of this in Europe, was elected in 2011 and began to argue that Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity, which is okay, except if you are not an ethnic Hungarian. And the problem is there are a lot of people who are not Hungarian living in Hungary, and a lot of Hungarians that live in surrounding countries. And this sets up a kind of basis for conflict that I think threatens the stability of that part of Europe. In India, the country India, the democracy that we know of as India, was established in the late 1940s as a liberal society because India is unbelievably diverse in terms of religion, caste, geographic region, language. And under Prime Minister Modi over the last few years, the definition of what it means to be Indian national identity has been shifted by his party, the BJP, towards one based on Hindu nationalism, which again is not a good situation for the almost 200 million citizens of India who happen to be Muslim or Christian or some other religion. And in the United States, we have elected since in 2016 a president who has attacked many of the institutions that constitute our constitutional order. President Trump came into office attacking the intelligence community, his own FBI, his own Attorney General. He denounced the mainstream media as enemies of the American people. And again, this is not unusual behavior for this kind of charismatic populist. As I said, they don't like institutions, but it's not good for the future of constitutional government because that is really what limits power in a modern democracy. Now, I think that there are really three drivers of this trend. One is conventional wisdom. It has to do with globalization. Globalization is the movement of people, investment, ideas, trade across international borders. And particularly in the last 30 years, this has exploded. This has led to good things like the rise of hundreds of millions of people in China, India, other developing countries out of poverty. But it's also had the impact of reducing the incomes of working people, low-skilled people in rich countries like the United States, Canada, Europe, and the like. And that has led to a decline in the social status of many older communities in these rich countries. Second driver is politics. There's a feeling in many democracies that they are paralyzed by interest groups, by division, by polarization, and there's a yearning for a strong man who can break through all the blather of parliamentary politics and really get things done. But the final issue that I think is really critical in explaining the rise of this kind of populist nationalism is cultural. It's the feeling that globalization has not only caused economic losses, it's caused cultural losses, that our national identity is being stolen from us by foreigners, by immigrants that are coming into the society, by foreigners that are taking jobs away from us. And so all of the anti-immigrant parties like the AfD in Germany or the National Rally in France, the people that supported Brexit in Britain make a similar kind of argument that our country is being taken from us and we are being replaced. And unfortunately, especially in a country like the United States that has a long history of racial politics, this is based on the fear of a number of people that, you know, the national identity defined in these racial or ethnic terms is changing before our eyes. I think that it also represents a kind of division that's emerged in many countries. It's based on a new kind of sociology of politics, where the basic division are not the old class divisions of the 20th century, but they're really divisions based on population density, where well-educated people that live in cosmopolitan areas, conglomerations like San Francisco or New York or Chicago or London or Paris tend to vote for liberal politicians, where people living in second and third tier cities in rural areas tend to have much more conservative values, and this is the political base of these populist politicians. I think that it is dangerous for democracy to make this shift from a 20th century politics based on economic ideology to a 21st century based on identity, because identity in the first place is an emotional commitment to membership in a certain fixed community, fixed in terms of things like race, ethnicity, and religion. And in a democracy that really depends on compromise and the ability of a pluralism of groups to get along with each other, this leads to a much more conflictual kind of politics. And in every country where you've seen this rise of populism, you've seen greater degrees of polarization. And I would say the United States is the prime example of this happening. What we do about this in the future is, I think, is a complicated thing. I think we have to address some of the underlying grievances that are brought about by globalization, some of the great inequalities of wealth and social status that globalization has created. And we also have to recognize that there is a longing or a certain sense of nostalgia for community, which in general politicians of the right have been better at cultivating than politicians of the left. But if we do not overcome the kind of polarization created by the rise of these populist parties, I think all of our democracies are in trouble. Thank you very much for your attention.